Hello. Haven't the talks been super good today? Oh my gosh, I'm blown away. I hope mine's good too. All right. Well, welcome and thank you so much. My name is Haley. I'm a video game lawyer, and shout out to Nintendo for suing Palworld this week and making my topic super cool. I actually care a lot about video game mechanic patents, so I'm very excited that Twitter cares a lot about it this week and that I get to talk about it with you today. So the topic we're going to be discussing is everything indie devs need to know about game mechanic patents. Yes, let's dive on in. So a disclaimer, everything in here is for informational purposes only, boring, yada, yada. But if you ever want the real deal, bam, hit a girl up, I'll help you out. Phoenix Wright is lawyer goals. I will die on that hill. All right, so essentially I'd like you all to leave this talk feeling a bit better about three things. Number one, what's a game mechanic? Or not, you know what that is. What's a patent? You guys know what game mechanics are. What's a patent? What is a game mechanic patent specifically? And how could game mechanic patents and the increased filing of them affect you and your own personal development cycles? So going through this talk, it's going to be split into 4 parts. Essentially, we're going to go through 3 years of IP law school in 5 minutes. That'll be intellectual property law 101. What is a patent? What are the requirements for a patent to actually get approved? We're going to think about really quickly, why did game companies even start patenting game mechanics? Why aren't they just relying on copyright, which is historically what they used to do in the past, up until some case law that sort of changed their minds. Some game mechanic patent examples, because as much as we can talk about them, it's much easier to think about them in the context of the ones that have actually gotten approved and are sitting on the registered dockets that could potentially be scary and affect you in how you develop. Looking at you, Warner Brothers Nemesis patent. I hate that patent. And what does this mean for indie devs? And that is going to be walking through a quick little thought experiment, considering what indie devs have to think about if a potential patent that is protected is a game mechanic that you want to use in your own game. All right, IP Law 101. So it's really easy to lump IP into one big bucket. Game devs are cool because you guys make all types of IP and you make a lot of it and you make it really, really fast. So all of these different forms of IP all fall under the umbrella of intellectual property in general. Normally, game development is focused a lot on copyright. So copyright could be the game in of itself. It could also be all of the elements therein, as long as they're literal forms of expression. So music, code, sound effects, all of these items, and then all of them together in the actual game is the copyright therein. So game developers make a lot of copyright. You can also trademark your game studio name to protect it in the business model from other companies from using your same name or your game name itself. Trade secrets, the Coke recipe comes to mind. As long as you keep the secret, you get to keep the protection within that item. And then of course, at the end is patents, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Patents are unfortunately the most technical form of intellectual property, so we have to cover a lot of information in relation to them very quickly. But if I could just boil it down to one sentence, they're the protection for an invention. So an invention could be a lot of different things. It could be a product, a composition, a machine, a process, or an improvement on a previous creation. So a significant amount of patents are actually just improvement patents on things that have already been filed in the past. So why even protect them? They're made in order to recoup the cost that could go into the creative effort and actually creating the patentable subject matter, because they grant you a monopoly period once they're approved. So no one else in the jurisdiction where you file is allowed to sell, market, license, use your patent protected work for the patent protection period, depending on where you file, which in most jurisdictions, Canada, Japan, US, for example, lots of other ones, that's going to be 20 years from the very first date you file. So you get a whole 20-year period of monolithic protection for that patent. People patent things in order to sell them, license them, create some commerce there, and also just to look like you have a big fat IP portfolio to attract investors as well. What can be patented? So we have some examples up here. Hardware, common and more easily understood items that can be patented. For example, the haptic system in the DualSense PS5 controller, that is patented. So if somebody wanted to go out and create a similarly made haptic system in a controller, they would have to get approval from Sony first and probably pay licensing fees in order to do so. Software in of itself, more new, but these are coming around more in the 90s and further on today. And then game mechanic patents, question mark, question mark, question mark. How are they getting approved? How is that even allowed? And that's kind of what we'll jump into today. So patent requirements. I can say patents are this, patents are that, but there's also a lot of requirements that go into, say I have an invention, it still needs to meet these criteria in order to then be approved, and then you get that 20 years of protection. So it has to be patentable subject matter. That is, it has to be, as I talked about before, product composition, all these kinds of things. And what's a really key thing to think about, and especially in terms of this talk, is you're not allowed to patent ideas, laws of nature, mathematical formulas, scientific principles, because what if I patented 2 + 2? What's 2 + 2? Lawsuit. Like, what would even happen? Our society would crumble, it would cease to function, right? So we're not allowed to patent ideas, we're allowed to patent the functions of those ideas and how those, and the functionality is there the thing that's novel and that we're allowed to patent. So that moves, of course, me into my next thing, novelty. Your patent must be new. So why should someone come along, file a patent, get a monopoly period on it if that thing already exists within the marketplace, or it's already been patented by somebody else? So when patents are being approved, there'll be these things called prior art searches. So essentially you're going through and you're making sure that what you're creating is completely novel, completely new, and only if there's no prior art within the public domain, the public space, then you could potentially get your patent on your new and novel invention. There has to be utility in your patent. This is kind of given for a lot of patents. Not many of them get questioned for utility, but it essentially just means it has to be useful. The most easy example to think about, a perpetual motion machine, cool, but it has no use. It's just gonna move forever. So that would be an example of a thing that could never get patent protected. And then non-obviousness is the last one. So your patent, the thing you want to protect, can't be obvious. And you might think, well, obvious to who? And it's going to be viewed for the lens of somebody who has a lot of skill in the art of where you made that patentable invention. So we call it a POSITA, which I think is cute. I like that acronym. I like using it. So it's person having ordinary skill in the art. So if I was designing, say, a microchip, or a game engine like Isa, who's way smarter than me, I would be looking for a technical engineer or a code engineer. And that would be the lens that I view whether or not something is obvious or not. So another fun anecdote for that situation, there was once a farmer who said, I have a revolutionary way of cleaning my barn. And it was a water tank and a sloped floor. So he turned on the water and it sloped down the floor. And he said, I'm going to patent this. I'm going to be a millionaire. And the office said, that's the most obvious thing of all time. You don't get the patent, sorry. So your patent has to also not be obvious. All right. Software patents. Ooh, these are the scary ones. So software patents, relatively new. That's in terms of the Patent Act, not in terms of video games. But the very first ones were approved back around the late 1960s. Since then, except more and more are approved year by year. And now over 50% of patents that are filed are software patents. So that's something to really think about. And this is kind of where we house game mechanic patents, because game mechanic patents are exercised via software. So they get naturally lumped into this software systems definition. And essentially this definition is used just to encompass every single invention that somehow uses a computer in order to process its implementation. So it could be a ton of different things, but put it simply, if it happens on a computer, it's probably going to be labeled as a software patent. Really quickly, just to compare the controversies that are kind of coming around to game mechanic patents, we've already sort of seen this in other areas of patent law with what are called business method patents. So these are patents that seek to protect, as they're labeled, a business method that you're using. So here's an example of a Canadian case. It was Amazon.com Inc. versus the Commissioner of Patents. Amazon wanted a patent on its one-click system. So you know when you just click on Amazon, you don't have to enter all your address in over and over and over, and how nice that is, and you spend 10 times more money. They were trying to patent that system in Canada. So originally, the Commissioner of Patents said no. It did go to the federal court, and it was ultimately approved in the long run. But what was a really key decision in that case is the Canadian court said that if the only new thing in your patent is the business method, and that business method is just an idea, then you don't get to have that patent because it's just an idea that happens to be occurring on, a software system or a website. There's another great case out of the US. So US is seeing similar case law as well. That one's called the Alice against CLS branch. And that one had a really more clear and succinct decision that just said, just because your patent protected work occurs on a piece of software doesn't mean it's no longer idea. So we're seeing a lot of patents get approved for things that are seemingly just ideas, but they happen on a computer. And then the patent filers are really good at writing these. So it sounds really software-y and it sounds very patent protectable. So some examples of how game mechanics can be defined in these patents is, I like to view them as hiding, like really sneaky style, inside software language. They're usually method patents, which means that you're trying to protect the method of doing something, kind of like how Amazon was trying to patent its method for one-click purchase systems. And it almost always starts with an original action that creates a reaction, and that original action almost always starts with the player, although there's some patents where that's not the case. So moving on to part two. Why did these huge game companies even start moving to patents in order to protect these things? So originally, it was copyright that these big game companies went after, other companies that were reverse engineering their code, their systems, their game mechanics. And then this kind of changed in the 90s when there was an Atari Games Corp versus Nintendo of America Inc. case. Nintendo is always litigating all the time. They're always in the name. So essentially what happened here was they had the 10 NES system, which was the lockout system used in the NES system that didn't let other game companies play games on the NES, only Nintendo approved ones. Atari didn't like this. Atari's like, we're gonna reverse engineer this and make our own games that work on the NES. So they tried to do it and they couldn't figure it out. So then they illegally went to the Copyright Office and lied and got a copy of the code, which is a big no-no. The lawyer did that actually. I would never do that. So what actually ended up happening in this case, which is interesting, is Nintendo actually won. So they weren't allowed to use their code system in order to create their product, but not because they tried to reverse engineer it, because they tried to steal the code like robbers in the night. Like that was the issue with the case. But what this case decided is that reverse engineering game code is not inherently an infringement. And this made big companies like Nintendo go, oh my God, crap, like what are we gonna do? So they started leaning way more heavily on patents, because even in this case, they were leveraging patents as well. And they were seeing a lot more success with patents getting enforced in these sort of disputes, as opposed to copyright, which as things progress, reverse engineering gets easier and easier. We also have forum shopping, which is a result of specific courts within the US specifically that have become really patentee friendly. So they have this weird draw where all these other companies, even if they're located in Japan or China, they'll come to litigate within the Eastern District Court of Texas, surprisingly enough, because it tends to be really patentee friendly. And there's been a lot of critique on how many patents, when they get litigated here, are always siding with the patentee friendly court. Approved. That was that's the Eastern District Court of Texas with patents. All right, so now we're going into game mechanic patent examples, which is my favorite part because I love reading through these. They're so fascinating and considering how they get approved. So the big baddie, most of you might know this one. This is the Nemesis system patent, which got a lot of attention a few years ago. It was the one that when people talk about game mechanic patents, they always seem to be talking about this one. But essentially what this patent was trying to protect was the really cool new Nemesis system in Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. In that, it's also honestly a sick system, and I wish it was in more games. Essentially, the orcs all have a hierarchy within this game, and when the player character interacts with one orc, it could then affect another third-party orc and the hierarchy system within there. So you have these really interesting systems behind all the scenes where these orcs are remembering all the crap you did to their friends and stuff and getting really mad about it, and then all the drama kind of originates from there. So they tried to file this 6 times and it didn't get approved. And then it finally got approved in 2021. So this is often the one people talk about when they're talking about game mechanic patents. Here's another one. This one's specifically from Nintendo. Oh, I think the computer froze. No, there we go. So this one's for a sanity system in a video game. And they put Link in the drawing, which I thought was really cute, even though he's not in this. It's for Eternal Darkness, but they use Link in all the drawings. So this is a patent that, again, you can read how they describe it in the claim, but if I were to just explain like I'm 5, there is a sanity meter, and the lower that goes, the more crazy stuff happens, whether that's more monsters showing up, the player could hear weird stuff, more other enemy incursions, all these kind of things. So this one's since expired, but this was a patent that existed for the entire length of protection time, 20 years. So it only expired a couple years ago. So Nintendo must like having that on its pocket. Here's another interesting one. This is for Dynasty Warriors. This was published in 2001. It's now expired. But here you can see they say a character group battle method which can express uneven distribution of attack power, defense strength, blah, blah, blah. Put more simply, if the playable character has a lot of other NPCs around it, that'll affect the stats of its attack or defense power. So depending on how close they are, the range, all this kind of stuff, it can affect that within a 3D dimensional battlefield. Here's another one I like to bring up that's more of a new one and actually still in force. So this is the dual reality game mechanic patent from Bloober team. This was used in the video game The Medium. And when this game was getting marketed, they actually leaned really heavily on the like our patented dual reality game system, which I think ended up biting them in the butt because gamers don't like game mechanic patents. But essentially what's interesting about this one is it really brings up the question of what's prior art to question these types of patents to see whether they're new or not, right? Because specifically with this game mechanic patent, what they were trying to patent was we have a single player game where it's split screen and the playable character is shown in 2 worlds at once. And when the player interacts with said playable character, they move within the 2 worlds simultaneously at the same time. So there's like a scary world and a happy world. I haven't played the medium, but that's essentially what it does. And so it was essentially protecting the method in which that game idea is executed via software. So my question is, who's the posita here, the person having ordinary skill in the art? Because now we're talking about a method of doing something with split screen capabilities, single player gameplay, and dual reality, like, you know, narrative explanations for why that character is in 2 worlds. It's not even so much a posita would be, you know, a game developer, someone with knowledge of how to create game systems, but the posita might be someone who's played every video game of all time to know whether this game mechanic has shown up before. And like, how on earth is the USPTO going to play every, I can't even do that. I like games. It's like, how are they going to play every single game? So, you know, in their claim, they actually bring up a few other games. They mention Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons. They say that game has dual stick control of 2 characters at once, but it's not split screen. They bring up some of the Lego superhero games. They say you can control lots of characters with one game unit, but there's not 2 worlds. You know, I personally think of Way Out. That's split screen, 2 characters in 1 world, but it's multiplayer, not single player. And then spoilers for Titanfall 2, plug your ears, that really sick level where you're jumping between the past and future. Yeah, right? Awesome. That's kind of like this, but just no split screen, right? So now we're thinking, I have to have knowledge about all of those game mechanics that have happened in games before, and I have to do a prior art analysis and also a non-obviousness analysis. But the USPTO hasn't played all the games, so they don't know really how to assess it from this angle, and they're viewing it more of the really technical software perspective, where I would argue this is really more of the idea of how cool this is, which it is a really cool system that just happens to be executed via software. And then for every one patent I'm talking about here, there's also so many more that are constantly getting approved in these really, albeit unique game ideas, but are ultimately built upon the ideas of past developers before them. They patent protected. They get, yeah, Katamari is patent protected. Isn't that the worst? You know, just travesty. So it really goes to show that there's just so many patents out there. And how is a game developer supposed to not only be knowledgeable about how all these patents exist, but then move forward with a strategy on, okay, I might have a game mechanic that infringes on one of these patents. What do I do? So that kind of moves us forward to part 4, which is what does this mean for you guys as indie devs? So I'm going to do a bit of a hypothetical here. And I don't work with Black Salt Games, by the way. I just really like Dredge. And I thought about dredge a lot when I thought about this prior analysis here. So here's the hypothetical. I really want to make a game with an insanity meter, but it's 2020. So we just have to pretend it's 2020 because then the patent would still exist. So you have to humor me a little bit. So I have this cool idea for a horror-based fishing game. That is such a good idea. And I wanted to have an insanity meter, which in Dredge, the insanity meter is seen in the top center of the screen. The more the eye starts to get red and go crazy, the more stuff happens within the environment, like monsters showing up, music getting scary, weather patterns happening. It's like, oh, this is going to be awesome. We can't wait to release. But, it's 2020, and Nintendo has a Sanity system patent that's currently ongoing. So what does this mean for me as an indie dev trying to release Dredge within the market? So here's an example in Eternal Darkness, what their thing, you can see the drawings a bit different, what their insanity meter ended up looking like and how they explained it to the character within the game. So ultimately, what ends up happening is you have to think about a few different ways forward. And that's also presuming that you even know this patent exists, right? But we're presuming that the developer happens to know this patent exists. What do we do moving forward? Do we push back release until after the patent expires? In this case, it was only going to be for another year or so, but what if the patent has another 20 years? Suddenly I'm screwed. Do I completely remove the game mechanic from my game? I would argue in the case of Dredge, if you remove the sanity meter mechanic, that's kind of the core mechanic of the game. And if you remove that, you're kind of removing what makes Dredge really unique. Do we publish and cross our fingers and hope nothing happens? That's what most devs are going to end up doing. But you could have some forethought and considerations like, have there been other games with insanity systems that have come out since 2003 that Nintendo hasn't attacked? Like Amnesia had insanity systems. To my knowledge, they've never had any legal issues with Nintendo. Potentially we'd be okay. It seems like they're not going after us. Then the more legal proceedings, you could submit a re-examination of the claim and say, hey, this violates prior art, this is obvious, this isn't novel, this doesn't have utility, any of those items. Lots of money to do that, tens of thousands of dollars to do that. Or you can initiate a court proceeding to try to impeach the patent and get it completely removed from the registry. Even more money, costs so much money to do this. And then you also risk of Nintendo getting mad and countersuing you even before your game releases. So it's like bringing on the fire before you even release. So unfortunately, these aren't all great ways forward, right? These are all sort of fear-based development motives. And with these patents getting approved, and to use the Nintendo and Pal World example, there's tons of other games that use mechanics that Nintendo has patented in the past, and Nintendo has dozens and dozens of game mechanic patents, but they don't go after them. So what they tend to do is hang back, relax, and see and figure out if something is worth going after, and then this creates a fear of retribution within the market. So right now, Pal World is the example. Nintendo says, we're going after you. Here's all our patents we're leveraging against you. And what this does is it makes all the rest of the game devs really scared of potentially getting that same wrath put upon them. So, it's unfortunate that these mechanics are getting approved when arguably a lot of them, not all of them, but quite a bit of them, you could argue are simply ideas that are executed via software and not unique functionality software that deserves to be patent protected. So while these ways forward aren't ideal, I hoped with my talk today that at the very least you could know a little bit more about what patents are, what a game mechanic patent is. So if you're ever put into this situation where you have to figure out a way forward, at least you know what it is, and you can work through that with your lawyer who now has to do prior art searches for games, which is really a huge bummer, and I hope it doesn't continue. But yeah, no, that's my talk today. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Hi, thank you so much for making such an abstract conversation so palatable to us.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question. Are you familiar with open source software?
Sorry, what was that?
Are you familiar with open source software?
Yep.
This is kind of like a weird question, but I wonder if there's such analogy to patents, so that the way open source software is counter-attacking closed software in the game dev world, can we potentially, as activists, do potential open source versions of patents so that we can also not have what Nintendo's doing right now?
So what's unfortunate is Nintendo has, and other companies, not just Nintendo, since I'm bragging on Nintendo only, but all these other big companies already have that patent protection. So technically speaking, if you were to do an open source version of whatever they patent protected, it won't be prior art because it's happening after they've already filed. So prior art's only stuff that's made before the effective date of filing of the patent protection. What I'd like to see is game development studios with a ton of money, cough, cough, Pal World, Epic, those kind of companies, get sued by Nintendo, decide to take on the case and take on the millions of dollars it costs to go after these patents, and we'll finally get some frigging case law. I'm so starved for case law of game mechanic patents being viewed as invalid because they're not meeting the criteria for patentability. So I love the heart of let's release all the open source software, but it does have to happen before they actually file those patents, if that makes sense.
On the left here.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
So I know that in the case of copyright law, there are situations where if someone has a copyright on something and then someone infringes on their copyright and they don't defend that infringement, then in future cases that copyright will be seen as like, well, you didn't defend it in the past, so you've basically like given up your copyright. Is that not the case for patents? Because you talk about the insanity meter thing, like by not going after Amnesia, do they cede the insanity meter patent or?
They're allowed to sort of sit on their laurels and decide who to strategically enforce their patents against. Like if you look at even with copyright, like Etsy, Nintendo doesn't go after every Pokemon keychain and stuff like that, but they still enforce their Pokemon rights elsewhere. And in the case of patents as well, their non-enforcement in general against other parties won't really matter. They're gonna kind of choose the white whale party, like the Pal World making tens of millions of dollars, because at the end they'll at least break even with the recoup they'll get on suing them. And then, they're not even really viewing it probably as monetarily gaining like a settlement value from them. They want to just have precedent that look what happens when you go after our patents, right? And that's sort of setting the tone in the industry that we don't impeach upon Nintendo's patents, I think, which is the ultimate long-term goal for their use and other huge AAA studios use in game mechanic patents. Yeah. No, oh, sorry, no more questions. I can't read. Yeah, feel free to ask questions to me outside. No worries.